G'day mate, I'm Greg and this is the dark side. But before we get started, make sure you smash that subscribe button, ring that notification bell so you don't miss out on the great content I'll be uploading every Saturday, just like this. G'day mate, today we're counting down 5 Australian serial killers you may not have heard of. Coming in at number 5, we have Paula Denyer. Paula Denyer was born Paul Charles Denyer in 1972 in the Sydney suburb of Campbelltown. During her teen years, she reportedly had trouble fitting in with her peers, which led on to problems studying for school and a lack of self-confidence. At the tender age of just 11, she repeatedly slashed the throat of her sister's teddy bears, as well as that of the family's cat, before hanging it in a tree. In later years, keeping a job proved difficult for her, and she was sacked a total of 7 times. By 1993, Denyer was a social outcast and was unable to keep a job due to laziness and incompetence. On one occasion, she was sacked for spending time making crude knives and daggers instead of attending to tasks attributed to her job. Between the ages of 20 and 21, and still identifying as a male at the time, Denyer had begun to stalk and attack women in the Melbourne suburb of Frankston in Victoria. The first known incident attributed to Denyer occurred in February 1993 when a young woman returned home to discover an intruder had slashed the throats of her cats and had left threatening messages scrawled in blood on the walls. It wasn't long before her crimes escalated to murder. Denyer's first victim was 18-year-old Elizabeth Stevens, who had come to Melbourne for studies. On the morning following her brutal murder, she had been found strangled and stabbed, with a vicious cut to her throat. A month later, in July 1993, Denyer struck again, this time taking the life of 22-year-old Deborah Freem in similar fashion. And in the same month, on July 30th, she struck for the third and final time, taking the life of 17-year-old Natalie Russell as she walked home from college. Following her capture and arrest, Denyer, still identifying as a male at the time, showed little to no emotion, no remorse, as she recalled every detail of her crimes. Denyer went on to tell police she had wanted to kill since the age of 14, and in the case of Elizabeth Stevens, the victim had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had been waiting in the vicinity of the bus stop to kill somebody, anybody. It didn't really matter who it was. During her trial, psychological examinations led to Denyer being diagnosed with sadistic personality disorder, a diagnosis supported by a total and complete lack of emotion regarding her crimes and a single-minded desire to kill. On the 20th of December 1993, Paula Denyer was ordered to serve 3 consecutive life sentences. However, on the 31st of December in the same year, Denyer lodged an appeal which was heard in July 1994, granting her a non-parole period of 30 years until 2023. Coming in at number 4 is Eric Edgar Cook. Between 1959 and 1963, the city of Perth in Western Australia was in the grip of fear, terrorised by Eric Edgar Cook, dubbed the Nightcaller. Eric Edgar Cook was born on 25th of February 1931 in Perth, Western Australia. As a child, he was clumsy and often hurt himself, quite often with injuries to his head, which led to the belief that he may well have suffered brain trauma. Bullying and teasing because of a hare lip, coupled with having an alcoholic father in a dysfunctional and violent household, meant he had very little self-confidence and was emotionally unstable. In his teen years, Cook turned to petty crimes, vandalism and breaking and entering into people's homes, and also was incarcerated for 18 months for arson. But it was Australia Day, 26th of January 1963, when Cook's crimes escalated to murder with a series of shootings. In the dead of night, doors were knocked on, doorbells were rung, and unsuspecting residents were shot at point-blank range the moment the door was opened. In all, 3 people died that night, while a further 5 were injured, the killer earning the nickname the Night Caller. Over the next few months, random killings continued with the death of 3 men and 5 women, the youngest being just 17 years old. Different weapons were used in varying attacks. Some people were shot, while others were stabbed, and there were no obvious links between the victims. The variances in the Night Caller's MO made it extremely difficult for authorities to know when or where or against whom the next attack may take place, or even what the Night Caller's true identity may be. In his younger years, Cook often left his fingerprints at the scene of his crimes. It would be ultimately proved to be his downfall. His fingerprints were matched to those on a rifle found hidden in bushes, a rifle used in an unsolved murder, and so a trap was set, authorities lying in wait for the culprit to return. 17 days later, Eric Edgar Cook returned for the weapon and he was arrested for the murder. Once in custody, Cook shocked investigators with his gleeful and confident confession to 8 murders, 14 attempted murders, and every crime he had committed. But despite his obvious enthusiasm, Cook pleaded guilty on the grounds of insanity. Evidence of his violent childhood and the suspected brain injury he suffered, all as a child, were presented to the court. But it was to no avail. When a director of mental health services assessed Cook and came to a very different conclusion. Eric Edgar Cook was convicted of murder in the Supreme Court of Western Australia on the 28th of November 1963. He was the last person to be hanged in the state of Western Australia before the death penalty was abolished altogether in 1984. Moments prior to his execution, Cook made a last-minute confession to the murder of 2 more women. Number 3 on our list is John Wayne Glover. John Wayne Glover emigrated from England to Australia in 1957 at the age of 25. With a history of petty crimes involving stealing, little time had passed in his new country before he was convicted of 2 counts of larceny in Victoria and a stealing charge in New South Wales. In 1962, he was convicted of assaulting 2 women in Melbourne, as well as another 4 charges of larceny. At the time, Glover was lucky to receive 3 years good behaviour bond as his sentence, but in time it would prove to be ineffectual in stemming his criminal ways. Glover had always had a troubled relationship with older women in his life, especially his own mother, who had several husbands and many boyfriends. In 1989, when Glover stepped up his criminal activity to the sexual assault and murder of elderly women, he had been married for 20 years and had 2 daughters. The press was quick to label the unknown murderer the Granny Killer, given the ages of his victims, which ranged from 60 to 93 years of age. Using a claw hammer as his weapon, he would follow elderly women into their apartment buildings or a quiet back street to deliver savage blows with his hammer to their head. On many occasions, the pantyhose had been removed and used to strangle the victims. On rare occasions, the pantyhose were tied into a bow at the throat of the victim, their shoes placed neatly at their side. Glover preyed on the elderly in several locations, including nursing homes, apartment buildings, back streets, and on one occasion, the palliative care ward of a hospital in January 1990. After being discovered and while running from the hospital, Glover had been recognised by a staff member for his food deliveries to the hospital, and as a result, authorities were alerted to the crime. Using a photo of Glover and statements from staff and the victim, positive identification of the attacker quickly became known, but a link to the murders was yet to be made. As a precaution, Glover was placed under constant surveillance, including the use of an automatic tracking device, but he would elude authorities by driving the wrong way up one-way streets or drive around the block several times. On the 19th of March 1990, John Wayne Glover took the life of his sixth and final victim in the Sydney suburb of Mosman. When authorities entered the premises, he was found lying unconscious in a full bathtub of water. A full bottle of Valium mixed with a full bottle of whiskey had failed to end his life.
Good evening. Tonight, a possible breakthrough in the year-long investigation into Sydney's granny killings. Detectives this afternoon charged a 58-year-old man with the murder of an elderly woman at Mosman.
In the bathroom, police found a 58-year-old man unconscious, immersed in a tub of water. He was revived by ambulance paramedics and taken to the Royal North Shore Hospital.
At his trial, Glover claimed diminished responsibility, but it was quickly proven that he had known exactly what he was doing during his crimes and that he had planned them in detail. John Wayne Glover's case was unusual in the fact that very few serial killers exist, and those that do are usually mentally ill or have an organic brain disease. The Crown prosecutor maintained Glover had been well aware of his actions and had taken steps to elude capture. As a result, John Wayne Glover was sentenced to consecutive life sentences for the murders of the 6 elderly women. On the 10th of September 2005, Glover was found dead in his prison cell. It was confirmed that the 72-year-old serial killer had hung himself. Number 2 is Paul Stephen Haig. Paul Stephen Haig was born on the 5th of September 1957. Between 1978 and 1979, at the age of 22, Haig killed a total of 7 people, including a 10-year-old boy, who Haig feared may identify him in the murder of the boy's mother. In 1978, within 2 weeks of being paroled for numerous armed robberies, Haig continued his crime spree. During an armed robbery of a lottery agency, Haig shot 58-year-old Evelyn Adams and 45-year-old Bruno Cingolani to death. But it wasn't until 1979 that Haig began killing people he believed knew too much about his crimes. They included an associate of Haig's, his associate's girlfriend, and her 10-year-old son, who was witness to the murder as they both sat in their car. But Haig's most brutal attack was yet to come. Haig's girlfriend, Lisa Brearley, was just 19 years of age when Haig allowed another man to rape her at knife point. After the vicious attack, Haig stabbed her 157 times in a frenzied and brutal assault. During his trial for the 6 murders, the court heard that after Haig's girlfriend had been slain, he allegedly said, "I only intended to do 20, referring to the stab wounds. But I lost count, so then I started counting out another 20. I kept making sure she was dead." After the trial for the murders, Paul Haig was ultimately sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Once Haig was incarcerated, it wasn't until 1991 that he took the life of his final victim. Haig insisted he'd done no more than assist Donald Hatherley to commit suicide by placing a noose around his neck and nothing more. But Haig was ultimately charged with the crime of murder, bringing a total of 7 murders to his name. Number 1 on our list is John Lynch. In its infancy, the small town of Berrima, located 130 miles south of Sydney, was a new settlement built in the Georgian style, but it was a frontier town too, on the edge of the bush, and like many similar settlements, it had its problems. John Lynch was born in the year 1813 in Cavan, a part of Ulster that is now within the Republic of Ireland. When he wanted to be, Lynch was courteous and charming. He had an easy way about him, and people came to trust him easily. He was also clever and always had a joke to tell to give people a sense of ease. Although he made friends easily, and despite his charisma, John Lynch was a loner. At the peak of the era of Australian transportation, Lynch was sentenced to deportation for the crime of robbery in 1832 and was deported alongside his criminal father at the age of 19. Upon arriving to Australia, Lynch was immediately sent to Hyde Park Barracks in Sydney and was put to work as a convict labourer, travelling around the district and working as needed. Eventually, his travels brought him to Berrima, where, after escaping, he was destined to join a gang of bushrangers and adopted the name of John Dunleavy. Tom Smythe was Lynch's first known victim in the year 1836, yet he was acquitted of the murder due to the drunkenness of the chief witness acting for the prosecution. His two accomplices in the crime, however, were not so lucky and were hanged for the murder of Tom Smythe. His acquittal was not the only streak of good luck to embrace him. Unbeknownst to authorities, John Dunleavy, as he was known, was in fact John Lynch. Had his alias been recognised, he would have been immediately returned to Hyde Park Barracks. Shortly after his acquittal, John Lynch stole 10 bullocks from an employer by the name of Thomas Cowper and headed to Sydney, where he intended to sell them. On that fateful journey, he met a man by the name of Jack Ireland, who was accompanied by an Aboriginal boy. Ireland was transporting a load of bacon, and Lynch quickly recognised the opportunity before him. Befriending Ireland and the Aboriginal boy, Lynch accompanied them on their journey to Sydney. That night, as Jack Ireland and the Aboriginal boy lay sleeping, Lynch bludgeoned both Ireland and the boy to death with an axe. As part of his eventual confession and in reference to the murders, Lynch would later state, "If there be such a thing as the devil, he was busy with me that night and would not leave me alone. It was as if something was tugging at my soul." Not long after the double murder, as Lynch was travelling back from Sydney with the cart now empty of bacon, he met a father and son by the name of Fraser who were transporting bullocks. Using his wit and charm, he befriended them and joined them on their journey. That night, as they all slept peacefully, a representative of Thomas Cowper arrived on horseback, inquiring as to whether they had seen a man with stolen cattle and an empty cart. Lynch managed to steer the man in the direction of a nearby inn, but he knew it would only be a matter of time before the old Fraser realised who Lynch really was. Fearing capture, Lynch made plans for the murder of the older Fraser and his son. Early the following morning, both father and son were killed with single blows to the head with Lynch's axe. John Lynch's next victims were the Mulligans, comprised of Mr. and Mrs. Mulligan, a stepson, daughter, and a servant girl. The family lived at Wombat Bush, a little way from Berrima. Lynch had a grudge against Mr. Mulligan after a previous business transaction had turned sour, but that didn't stop Lynch from using his charm to make peace with him and be accepted into their household. On the first night of his stay, everyone enjoyed drinks by the fire, but Lynch was careful not to become drunk. In his eventual confession, he stated, "Thoughts were in my head and the time was coming on. I got up and walked outside. It was a clear and cold night. I looked up at the bright moon and I prayed to Almighty God to direct me. I asked heaven to guide me and point out to me what to do. I went inside and after having another rum, I took up my axe and said I would cut a few barrow loads of wood if John the son would wheel them in." As the young boy walked towards the wood heap, Lynch followed close behind, and struck the boy down with a single blow with his hatchet before hiding his body in bushes. Next was Mr. Mulligan, killed in similar fashion as his son during a moment he was separated from his wife, and then Mrs. Mulligan herself after a vicious kick to the stomach. His axe and clothes covered in blood, John Lynch turned toward the house. Inside was the Mulligan's 14-year-old daughter, who saw him coming, covered in blood with axe in hand. In desperation, she grabbed a carving knife and was told by Lynch it would be useless against him. "Lay your knife down and I will give you 10 minutes to pray," Lynch offered. But as soon as the Mulligan's daughter laid the knife down, Lynch grabbed her, raped her, and bludgeoned her to death with his axe. Intending to take the farmhouse for himself, Lynch faced a dilemma. The Mulligans were well known, and the area in which they lived well travelled. Their bodies may be easily discovered if he buried them. So, instead, he chose to build a large bonfire and burn them in the flames. They burned like bags full of fat, he would later confess. Kearns Landragin was Lynch's next victim. The two met on the road not far from Razorback, and feeling at ease in Lynch's company, Landragin foolishly boasted about having left his wife and taken a large portion of her share in their cash. In his eventual confession, Lynch declared, "He had no feeling, and my heart began to turn against him and feel hatred for him as a selfish and hard-hearted man." Now the next morning, as Landragin smoked his pipe, Lynch crept up behind him and struck with his axe, killing him with a single blow. It was the 21st of February 1841 when a bullock driver by the name of George Sturgis discovered the partially hidden body of Kearns Landragin and alerted authorities. There were multiple appalling wounds on the dead man's head, suggesting a frenzied attack with an axe. Cart tracks and horse hoof prints were also found heading towards Berrima. On Friday, the 26th of February, a witness by the name of John Chalker stated he had seen Landragin dining in his establishment called the Woolpack Inn with a man by the name of Dunleavy who had taken Landragin as his servant. A search of Lynch's farm soon followed with John Chalker present, and a hat belonging to Kearns Landragin had been recognised by Chalker as having been the same hat the dead man had been wearing in his establishment. John Lynch was immediately arrested on suspicion of murder and vehemently declared the hat to be his own, stating, "I am innocent. I will leave it to God and man. I do not blame you, Chapman, but I do blame Chalker for interfering too much." Further searching of the farmhouse produced several personal effects belonging to John Lynch and bearing his real name. Hence his true identity became known. Lynch was tried for the murder of Landragin on the 25th of March 1842. Authorities suspected Lynch of being guilty of other murders, but without the bodies there was little they could do. Forensics would not become available in such circumstances for many, many years to come. Testimonies from James Bryan, a labourer, Thomas Cowper, and a member of Cowper's team by the name of Joseph Harrison sealed John Lynch's fate. As his execution date drew closer, Lynch summoned the police magistrate, Mr. Bowen, and a parson, and made a full confession of his crimes on the eve of his execution. Why is anyone's guess, but given John Lynch's character in mixed company, it can be assumed his confession was born of the desire for notoriety. If it were not for Lynch's full confession, the residents of Berrima would never have known a serial killer had been operating in their midst. On the eve of his execution, Lynch's confession seemed to be driven by a desire to create a legacy where he would be forever remembered for his crimes. But it was not to be. In time, despite news of his crimes reaching as far and wide as his motherland of Ireland, he was destined to be forgotten. The memory of the man and his crimes lost to the sands of time. But one fact still stands true to this day. John Lynch, aka John Dunleavy, aka the Axeman of Berrima, was and always will be one of Australia's first known serial killers. Okay, thank you so much for watching. If you'd enjoy my channel, please subscribe and hit that like button. And as promised, I'll be uploading again each and every Saturday.